Namaskar. This is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. The Finance Minister Smt Nirmala Sitharaman made some serious allegations against the Congress-led erstwhile UPA government last week. While expressing the government's inability to reduce taxes and duties in order to reduce the price of fuels like petrol and diesel that we pay for, she told reporters that the government of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi is today paying for the oil price reduction done by the UPA government in 2012-2013. Look at that trickery, she said, pointing out that the previous government had cut taxes on fuels but had left the present government with the burden of servicing and repayment of oil bonds. She then said that we do not do so many tricks like the UPA government. They, which is the UPA government, issued oil bonds for which the principal amount is over rupees 1 lakh crores and towards which for the last 7 fiscal, she said, the Modi government has been paying interest of over 9,000 crores per year on those oil bonds. The finance minister further said that if she did not have the burden to service the oil bonds, then she would have been in a position to reduce the excise duty on fuel. She then said that the UPA took credit for keeping the prices of fuels low, but today the government is paying through its nose for the trickery that the UPA government indulged in. The use of the word trickery by the finance minister, according to us, is serious, and it challenges the very integrity and credibility of the government which had issued those bonds which she refers to as a trickery. Let us therefore examine the alleged trickery of issuance of bonds by the government and see for ourselves who's tricked whom, or whether the issuance of those bonds was a trickery that the finance minister terms as. It was during the period of 2005 to 2008 that international oil prices hit a high of $147 a barrel. At that time, unlike now, prices of petrol, prices of diesel, prices of cooking gas had not been deregulated by the government in India, and they were subsidized by the government. To prevent the buildup of inflation which burdens the common man, fuel was then sold at below the cost price of the oil marketing companies, and the resultant loss was subsidized by the government through cash subsidies which were paid by the government directly to the oil marketing companies, and these were funded through the union budget. Being short of funds during 2005 to 2010, the government did not pay the cash subsidy to the oil marketing companies, but it instead gave them oil bonds aggregating to about 1.3 lakh crore rupees. These bonds carried an interest rate of 8 to 8.4%, and they have a repayment tenure of 15 to 20 years, which explains why interest is being paid on them each year and why they are now going to fall due for redemption and payment. While the issuance of such bonds is not quite a prudent and transparent practice, this was, however, not the first time in India that the government had done so. Earlier, bonds totaling to rupees 20,000 crore were issued in 1995 to recapitalize the shaky government-owned public sector bank. And thereafter, in 2002, the BJP-led NDA government also issued oil bonds to the tune of 9,000 crore rupees in order to cover up the deficit in the oil price subsidy pool at that time. Let's further talk about those oil bonds that the finance minister calls to be a trickery. The issuance of these oil bonds gave relief to the cash-starved UPA government, not just by postponing the repayment of oil subsidies to the extent of rupees 1.3 lakh crores, but it also reduced its fiscal deficit to that extent, because by the issuance of oil bonds, the government did not technically incur an expenditure for that year. The government follows the cash system of counting, and thus, if the payment is delayed, it does not amount to an expenditure incurred by the government. However, while the issuance of oil bonds postponed the oil subsidy payment of 1.3 lakh crores, the government now had to pay annual interest of 9,990 crores on those bonds to the oil marketing companies till the time the bonds were not redeemed and repaid. The UPA government and its second tenure thus paid interest of 53,163 crores on these oil bonds, and thereafter the Modi government has paid interest of about rupees 70,000 crores so far at rupees 10,000 crores per year, which hardly impacts or aggravates the government fiscal deficit, which runs into lakhs of crores per year now. Now let's talk about the bonds repayment and the collection of the government against it by way of the heavy taxes that we pay on petrol, diesel and cooking gas that we buy. The repayment of the principal amount of these bonds begins in the current financial year. About 10,000 crores is due to be paid in financial year 21-22 towards these bonds, and thereafter the repayment will continue on an annual basis till financial year 2025-26. In financial year 2025-26, the amount to be repaid is about 36,913 crores towards the principal amount of these bonds, and similar payments are due in the years from now onwards. It is on the excuse to meet this annual interest payment of 9,990 crores on the oil bonds that the government has collected lakhs of crores of rupees since 2015 by sharply increasing the excise duty and cess on petrol and diesel, and it refuses to bring them down. The duty on petrol in 2014 per litre used to be 9.48 rupees, and today it stands at 41.9 rupees per litre. While the government has paid annual interest of 9,990 crores towards the oil bonds, it has thus collected far more by way of taxes every year. While such fuel tax collections amounted to 72,160 crores in financial year 2014-15, they shot up to collections of 2.73 lakh crores in 2016-17, and it was a massive figure of 4.18 lakh crores in 2020-21, which actually is far more than what the government needs to repay and service oil bonds, for which reason it has levied such heavy taxes and duties on the fuel. So the fact is that collecting massive taxes for the servicing and repayment of oil bonds issued by the UPA government has just been an excuse for the Modi government to levy such high taxes on petrol, diesel and cooking gas that we pay for. Now let's talk about the alleged trickery, as the Finance Minister says, in the issuance of such bonds by the government. The fact is that if the issuance of such bonds is termed as a UPA trickery by the FM, then the Modi government too has indulged in it, in fact, on a much larger scale. In order to recapitalize the bankrupt public sector banks, the government has issued recapitalization bonds of 3.1 lakh crores to the bank so far. That's far more than the bonds of 1.3 lakh crores towards oil subsidy issued by the UPA government. To do that, which is to issue such recapitalization bonds, surplus public deposits lying with public sector banks have been issued to subscribe to low interest bearing government bonds, and that public money has been pumped back by the government into the banks by way of share capital. It's a circular routing of funding that has been done. That ironically amounts to a prohibited practice of giving loans to shareholders to subscribe to share capital of a company. That's just what has been done. Bank money itself has been pumped back in order to shore up its share capital. The repayment of these recapitalization bonds starts from 2028 to 2035. And since the amount of these NDA issued recapitalization bonds is much more, the government now pays to the public sector banks an annual interest of over rupees 20,000 crores as against 10,000 crores that it annually pays on the oil bonds issued by the UPA government. Incidentally, the issuance of these bank recapitalization bonds has had the approval of the Reserve Bank of India, of the Ministry of Finance, and of course of the sycophant bankers who called it a bold reform and a big bang move by the government. And like in the case of issuance of oil bonds, the bank recapitalization bonds too helped to window dress and reduce the fiscal deficit of the government for that year, unmindful of the practice and the fact that The banks have thus been compelled to invest public deposits in low interest securities of the government instead of lending them at much better rates. The larger picture that emerges from the statement of the Finance Minister of the trickery is that the government has collected much more than what it needs for the servicing and repayment of oil bonds. In the finance year 2021 itself, while it paid interest of 9,990 crores on the bonds, its collections by way of duty and cess on petrol and diesel was about 4.18 lakh crores. That itself negates the finance minister's claim that duties on fuel cannot be brought down because the oil bonds issued by the earlier government are burdening the finances of the government. The collection by the government is far in excess of what it is paying to service and repay the bonds. The second, with uncertain and stagnant collections towards direct and indirect taxes, these huge duties on fuels are an easy and convenient mode for the government to shore up its finances. That's a fact. The government has every right to do so, but let it not be blamed on the oil bonds, since that is not the case, and it is clearly misleading to contend so. The government has a right to levy taxes, but let it not be done by blaming an earlier government, especially when the facts speak otherwise. The third is, the fact is that even though such high duties on fuel are fueling inflation, which is always politically risky, and yet the government refuses to prune them, it only shows the desperation of the present government over the weak state of its finances, and that's why it continues to collect these taxes. The next point, we consumers are paying for fuel far in excess of their market prices. While about 52% of the price that we pay for petrol is the actual cost of the petrol, the rest, 58%, goes to the government by way of duty and cess. Deregulation of petrol products was meant to benefit the consumer, but as we see, it has benefited the government more. The huge taxes that the government collects is the benefit that it takes at the cost of the consumer. The next issue on the larger picture is that if the present government claims that the issuance of oil bonds is a trickery, then it too is guilty of it on a much bigger scale by way of the recapitalization bonds that it has issued. The fact is that the government is in dire needs of funds. A more transparent response to its fundraising by way of higher duties through all the duties that it collects on fuel items would actually add to its credibility instead of blaming the UPA government of a trickery, which it also is guilty of, if at all it is a trickery. And finally, if the government is complaining of the legacy of oil bonds, then it is leaving a far bigger one for whichever party is going to be in power between 2028 to 2035, which is when these bank recapitalization bonds are going to be due for redemption. And the party then in power is going to handle or face this alleged trickery that the finance minister talks about. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.